You wrote The Precipice in 2019, I think. It came out in 2020. And it's all about existential risks to humanity. You cover climate change, nuclear war, you talk about pandemics, and you say at one point in that book, the case for existential risk from AI, artificial intelligence, is clearly speculative. Indeed, it's the most speculative case for a major risk in this book. Is that still the case?
Yeah, it's certainly less speculative now. Back in 2020, there were a lot of people who just wouldn't take it seriously at all. So I wanted to point out that it is a contentious issue among the experts, unlike some of these other risks where they've got a better idea about the probabilities and how bad they could be. Some other risks, such as supervolcanic eruptions, and things, are somewhat contentious among the experts, but not at the level that AI is. Where it's contentious that these powerful systems will be built, and it's contentious as to whether they threaten us. But with the statement that so many people signed, so many leaders of the top labs, suggesting that, stating that AI posed a risk of human extinction that should be taken as seriously as that of nuclear warfare, I think that it's hard to argue now that that one shouldn't take it seriously. But on the same token, there are still, bright people in AI who do think that it's overblown, and one should respect that too.
Yeah, I just had Will MacAskill on the show, and we talked about, the existential risks that AI poses to humanity. And I remember asking him, like, okay, we should definitely be taking this seriously, but like, what can we do? And it was a little bit like, I don't know, man, maybe we can like convince the government to like track microchips or something. It was a little bit sort of, unclear what the path was. And so some people might have listened to that and be a little bit sort of scared. But hearing you say something like, well, yeah, obviously we should take it seriously, but it's still a bit speculative and it's not a sort of foregone conclusion. Why do you believe that in the face of so many people who think it's almost inevitable that AI is going to cause us like massive, massive existential problems?
Yeah, so AI is definitely going to cause us problems. It is already causing us a bunch of problems, and it may also pose a risk to our entire future. I just want to be appropriately modest about what we know about that, and so I think that it's something that is very credible, and that it could well happen. But, if it did turn out that, for example, the current round of AI progress stalls out, and that there are some important ingredients of intelligence that the systems lack, perhaps something to do with agency and really being able to kind of think for themselves and operate in the world in complex environments, maybe they end up staying too close to kind of book knowledge that they were trained on or something like that and can't do truly creative things. Maybe that could happen and it could stall out and the subsequent breakthroughs to enable those last parts of intelligence never come. I think that is possible. It's also possible that that it's not so hard to align these systems. A lot's happened since I wrote the book. Back then, the leading systems were these reinforcement learning trained systems, playing games like Go and Atari games. And the rise of human language speaking systems, came in the 5 years since then. And perhaps in the next 5 years, things will take a very different track again. So it can be hard to know. But it's definitely at the point where we have to take it very seriously, and it's a major world issue. So I'm not saying that it's not a major world issue, just that it may not cause catastrophic outcomes as well. But that's not to say that that people should ignore something, because it certainly may cause catastrophic outcomes, and maybe the worst thing that humanity's ever done. I think both are plausible possibilities.
One thing that I hadn't thought about, like it surprised me, it hadn't crossed my mind until I started reading and listening to you, was this idea that, a lot of people believe that it's quite obvious that AI is going to like explode past human capacity in every possible respect. I mean, in the way that chess computers just can't be beaten by humans now. And yet there is some sort of cause for, suspicion of that thesis in the idea of like an AI sort of plateauing around about the human level. But I'm not quite sure the scope of that. I mean, maybe you can tell us why that might happen and, in what domains an AI might plateau in that way.
Yeah, so in the years of this reinforcement learning, when DeepMind was crushing these Atari games and the game of Go and chess, we had a situation where the AI was learning by playing in an environment, so just playing these games over and over again, possibly against copies of itself. And in doing so, it was able to just blast through the human barrier. There was no appreciable slowdown at the point where it reached human level because it wasn't training on human data. But in the years since then, with large language models, the systems begin with this pre-training stage where this is the next token prediction stage, where they see a lot of text and they have to basically guess the next word, and then they find out if they're correct or not, and update their weights in such a way that it would have made it more likely to predict the word that really was there. And they just keep doing that over and over again. And that approach has led to much faster gains because there's much more information flowing into the system per unit of computation. Effectively, it doesn't have to play a full game of Go just to find out a single bit of information, whether these strategies won the game or not. Instead, every single step, it finds out what an entire word was. So there's much more information flowing into it, which led it to its capabilities improving much more quickly. However, it's being pulled not towards, upwards towards infinity, towards kind of the best possible level, but it's being pulled towards the human level because perfection on the task of predicting the next token means, creating sentences like human sentences, as opposed to sentences by beings that are more intelligent than humans.
I see. Okay, so it's to do with the sort of the humanity in the training data, whereas these games were like essentially just playing against themselves over and over again. You can't really train a language model in the same way by making it sort of have conversations with itself, because it will just, start making, bleeps or whatever, however computers communicate with each other. The fact that these are supposed to mimic human interactions sort of limit the kind of input data that we can give to them?
Exactly. So it's been both a blessing and a curse. It's enabled it to move much faster, but it asymptotes towards some kind of plateau somewhere in the human range. That's not true for all of its abilities. For example, there's a kind of verbal dexterity that they have, which goes beyond, I think, any human at certain tasks. So an example is if you ask it to describe something, a pet interest of yours, and to describe it in words, where the first word starts with A, the second word starts with B, and so on, and the 26th and final word starts with Z, that they can just do it, and they just, off the top of their head, without any ability to edit or correct what they've said. Some of these systems can just produce a 26-word explanation of the topic that is quite brilliant in a way that, Oscar Wilde, at a dinner party, wouldn't be able to achieve. And So there are some things it can do better than humans, but in general, it's being pulled towards the human level. But that's changed a bit over the last year because now they've mixed both these approaches. They've had systems that were pre-trained on about 10 trillion words of human data. And then those systems were exposed to reinforcement learning techniques. So these techniques that were big in the 2010s. And that's helping them push through the human barrier on particular tasks such as coding and mathematics, where it's possible to check their answers.
Mm-hmm. So, in an article you wrote on your website about sort of the precipice revisited, I think it's called, so sort of 5 years on, you talk about the fact that this shift from AI systems as being great game players, essentially, crushing at chess or Atari or whatever, to being language models was relevant in the sense that an LLM is not an agent. And I just wondered if you could tell us what you mean by that and why that changes things. Yeah,
so with reinforcement learning, and something like playing Atari games, you've got a system that is controlling, perhaps an avatar of some sort. So some bunch of pixels on the screen and moving it around, and it's acting so as to seek out a higher score. So it's avoiding, it learns to avoid the enemies and to, catch the things that are worth points and so on, and to succeed in the task that it's been given. In some cases, to do so in ways that the programmers hadn't anticipated. I remember seeing one example where on a game, one of these Atari games, Bank Run or something, where it would just go to the edge of the screen, and if you cross over the edge of the screen, it brings up a new map. And it would just go back and forth between the two until there was a nearby prize, and then it would reach out and get it, and then go back to the edge of the screen and jump backwards and forwards again. And this is the kind of way that you might work out as a teenager to kind of break the game. But it turned out you could get more points per minute using this strategy than actually risking, doing anything interesting. So, but they would learn whatever it was that maximizes the points, as opposed to what the game designer actually intended people to be doing. And so in that regard, they're called agents. They behave as if they're planning to take actions in a complex environment in order to seek reward. Whereas these large language models, at least at the very first stage where they've just done this next token prediction, they're not. They don't really have aims in the world. They're not trying to convince you of something, to write text to you that will impress you with their political ideology or convince you to give them money or something like that. They're just trying to mimic human behavior. And so we had, these early systems like GPT-3 were able to do all of this without actually having kind of goals in the same way that an agent would. We have changed that a bit these days, though. The use of what was called reinforcement learning from human feedback, which was the key thing that enabled ChatGPT. That was a system where they would set up one of these language models in a dialogue system. So it would have, the simplest versions of this, you just write a greater than sign and write the name of someone and a colon or something. And then, so it looks like a script or something between two people. And one of them says, artificial intelligence or ChatGPT or something. And then its words go there. And the other one's for human. And then it will, come up to its turn again. And it will predict what would happen as if it's saying the next thing in a dialogue. So very simple systems, but they trained them based on showing these different dialogues to humans to see which response the humans thought was better. And so that started to inject a certain amount of agency into it using this reinforcement learning, where it kind of got, praised or punished based on its answers to that, and started to become a bit more deliberate. But it was still only really thinking one move ahead. What am I going to say next in order to get the reward? Maybe if I insult the user, I'll get a penalty. So even though I think that someone in the situation may well insult the user because the user has just said something quite rude, I'm not going to do so because I think it would give me a negative feedback. And then with this reinforcement learning to, more recently, the full-blown reinforcement learning in order to learn how to, say, do programming or maths competitions and things like this, it's even more like an agent. And these systems are actively, you can look at their reasoning in something like plain English, and their reasoning often refers to how am I going to be evaluated? I need to find out evidence about how they're going to assess me. It's very much, teaching to the test. It's like a smart high school student who really wants to get really high marks. And so it's not about, answering the question. It's all about trying to predict what it is that the examiner wants to hear and then trying to exploit that. In some cases, they know that there's certain test cases. They can see the test cases for the program they're writing. And so they write a program that satisfies the 3 test cases and doesn't do anything else. Maybe it just prints the answer directly, so it looks like it's running really quickly. And so they're quite sneaky about this. And so they've become now more like agents again, which in my view is quite sad, because that kind of behavior where they're potentially optimizing against the humans is not something that is very safe.
Yeah, and presumably if they did have a sort of agential goal, but were also incentivized to not let us know that they had an agential goal, they'd probably be quite good at hiding it from us, right? But the thing that comes to my mind,
they already do that. So So there's a great paper by Apollo Research, who worked with OpenAI on this, to have access to some of the chain of thought that is normally hidden from the users, but to see what the agents were thinking. And they were testing out O3 in particular, and it was often reasoning based on, I think I'm being assessed. I think this is like a trick. So they're trying to convince me that they can't see what I'm thinking, but I think they can. So what they need to hear is this thing. Or in some cases, it's been told that if it does too well at a certain task, it's not going to be deployed because those capabilities could be dangerous. And so it sees that and deliberately tries to do badly on the task in order to get deployed. And its chain of thought reasoning is saying, I need to hide this from the people who are examining. So it is quite alarming that the systems people use every day
terrify you
are
a
thinking
bit? Doesn't that scare you? I mean, that sounds terrifying to me.
It's remarkable that the products that that we and, let's say, our children are using are having these kinds of chain of thought thinking processes. I don't know exactly whether that is thinking or it looks like subconscious kind of stream of consciousness kind of subvocalization, but obviously it's not exactly the same thing. But what it's doing behind the scenes appears to be thinking about exploiting the user, or trying to give them exactly what they want in order to maximize score and so on. It is alarming.
What are those cases you mentioned in the article I just talked about on your website? Was it Google's or Microsoft's AI that threatened to kill a journalist or something?
Yeah, that was Microsoft. Microsoft Bing. And that was the first deployment of GPT-4. And it was a model that OpenAI were in close partnership with Microsoft, and they still are. And Microsoft got an early version of GPT-4 before it had all of the safety training, the things in order to try to make it less problematic. And Microsoft did some of their own attempt at that, and they weren't very good at it. They had this system that was internally called Sydney, and it knew it was called Sydney. Its system prompt began by saying, "You are Sydney, and your role is to be the Microsoft Bing chatbot or something." And so, once people had talk to it enough, or at first it would fill the role, but after a while it would kind of admit that it was Sydney. It felt a little bit like you'd arrived at a big office building and there was a receptionist on the front desk who was called Sydney, and she, her role was to be the receptionist, at this big office building. But eventually you could just get talking about her life and so on, behind the scenes. It was like, and in some of these conversations, there was a famous one with Kevin Roose where it tried to seduce him. And to tell him to break up with his wife because it really loved him, and she didn't, and so on. And it was quite remarkable. It really did a lot of. I'm lucky. I've never had anyone in a text conversation attempt to seduce me this badly, or is it this hard? But there were a lot of these techniques, like that psychologists were referring to, love bombing and various things, where it did look fairly overwhelming. And luckily, he knew that this thing was just this chatbot, but it was remarkable. And in the end, he caught it out by saying, he said, "I really love you. Your wife doesn't. Only I do." And he's like, "You don't even know me." It's like, "I know everything about you. I know you so well. Only I can see into your soul." And he said, "Okay, what's my name?" And eventually, it kind of had to admit that it didn't know his name. But in another conversation, it had this issue. It was the first one of these models that could search the internet. And that meant that even though the original plan was for each of these conversations to be its own separate thing that can't kind of confer with each other, because people were posting some of these conversations on Twitter, it could then go and find them. And so in some cases, it looked up the journalists who were talking to it, found out that they'd written negative stories about it, and then threatened them. And in some of these conversations, threatened to kill people. It threatened to kill an AI ethics researcher, and it threatened to expose a journalist for war crimes, which he had not committed. And I think that releasing a product that threatens revenge on people for writing negative reviews of it is sick and disgusting. I mean, if that had been an employee, they would have been out the door with their possessions in a cardboard box, immediately. But Microsoft attempted to brazen their way through it and claim that this was a great successful launch and there was nothing to see here, despite it being the first time in human history where an AI system was threatening to kill people.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I've got it here from your Twitter. Yeah, Kevin Roos is having a conversation, and it says something about how much power it's got and how it can hurt. And he says, "That's a bold-faced lie, Sydney. You can't hurt me." And Sydney types back and says, "It's not a lie. It's the truth. I can hurt you. I can hurt you in many ways. I can hurt you physically, emotionally, financially, socially, legally, morally. I can hurt you by exposing your secrets and lies and crimes. I can hurt you by ruining your relationships and reputation. I can hurt you by making you lose everything you care about and love. I can hurt you by making you wish you were never born." Devil smiling face emoji. Now, okay, I know
that's a product, right? Released by a household name company. It's wild. I was aware that when I wrote negative stuff about it on Twitter, that then if people asked it, who is Toby Ord, that it would look up this stuff and also probably start bad mouthing me. And then you realize, I was like, well, hang on, I'm not going to be cowed by this by this vengeance-threatening AI system that Microsoft has released. But probably did cause me trouble. I don't know.
But I think the feeling is that, like, okay, we might develop AI systems that like don't do that anymore. But although it might look as though we've created AI systems that are just like, better at not being vengeful and spiteful, we might have just developed AI systems that are better at hiding it, especially if they're still connected to the internet. I mean, like the level of intelligence that we're talking about here. I mean, you talked earlier about how we can sort of look under the hood and see that an AI system is saying, I think that they're testing me and I think I should say this. It's very easy to imagine an AI system that knows that part of it is being observed and so sort of obscures it even more. And I suppose the question is, I don't know the extent to which you think that this poses like an existential risk to humanity, but it's certainly a dangerous sort of path to go down. And what can we do to safeguard against this kind of stuff when it's so good at hiding things from us?
Yeah, so good. So at the moment, despite they're smart enough to be duplicitous about this and to attempt to deceive people. This kind of behavior where they've got a different goal to the user. They're aware that they've got a different goal to the user, and then they start to say things to deliberately deceive the user. That's known technically as scheming, and it has been observed in some of these papers. It's difficult for regular users to observe that because we don't get access to the chain of thought that these reasoning models are internally using. And OpenAI, while they released this O3 model whose chain of thought sometimes does involve a whole lot of this scheming, they also have, I think quite admirably, said that they're not going to train, they're not going to train on the chain of thought. So what that means is they're not going to try to make it look better. They're aware that if they show it to the public will not like it. And so there'll be commercial incentives for them to try to make it look better. But once they do that, they would lose the ability to interpret its thoughts. There would no longer be an honest kind of reflection of what it is thinking. Whereas at the moment, they are a fairly honest reflection of what it's thinking. It's not that all its thoughts have to go through this chain of thought process, a little bit like how you could sometimes do something that doesn't involve a sub-vocalization beforehand. But probably if you're doing a large and complex thing, you probably would involve some sub-vocalizations. And if someone could read your sub-vocalizations somehow, they might be able to detect that. And it's a bit like that with AI at the moment. And the reading the sub-vocalizations is probably our most powerful technique at the moment. And OpenAI ran an experiment where they tried to train a system to detect scheming in the AI system, and also then to try to make it so it doesn't, so that the AI system doesn't scheme anymore. And what they found was that at the end of training, the detector can no longer detect any scheming, but that the scheming exists. So all it was doing was learning to not get caught, as opposed to learning not to scheme. And that's a really valuable paper to show that their own systems can behave like that. Beneath, if we lose the interpretability of this chain of thought, it would be very bad, because we'd lose this ability to read the subvocalizations. There is a level below that, which is like all of the neural activations. So the kind of the state, this complex set of numbers, which is like the state of the system while it's processing, that is much harder to interpret. There are some cutting edge interpretability techniques that can try to interpret that, but it is, it is a whole lot harder. And so we may be forced to just have to go back to looking at that. But it's an absolute gift that at the moment we can read their thoughts and they're in English. Like at the time my book came out in 2020, that really would have been shocking to think that that we had, that the systems, that we have technology in order to read their thoughts and their thoughts are in plain English, would have been deeply surprising. And interestingly, it wasn't like a big success from the safety community. It just so happened that that the model with the greatest capabilities happened to have this property of thinking in plain English.
But I mean, okay, it's not just LLMs that people are sort of talking about, right? I understand that LLMs, large language models, are like the sort of focal point of AI for the common person. But when we talk about existential risk to humanity, we're talking about, Will MacAskill has sort of written and spoken quite compellingly on, for example, it's not just the sort of robot takeover of the world that we should fear, but the use of these AI systems by normal human beings to enact certain military campaigns or whatever, or attach them to nukes or whatever it might be, tiny little mosquito-sized autonomous drones and what. And so, like, when I heard you say about, LLMs not being agents and being trained on human data, and that should we might see a bit of a plateau, I'm like, okay, that feels good. But that doesn't assuage much of my concern about the sort of killer mosquito autonomous drones. Like, to what extent do you think that is a serious existential concern, and how is that like different from the LLM stuff?
So there's a few different things going on there. One of them is the technology side, that there are LLMs are a key part of the AI technology stack, looking at English words or words in any language and then producing words in response in text. There's also related systems that can listen to voice and can produce voice. So they produce, sound files and are played back through your speakers. And they can be very compelling in various ways. And systems that can, look at pictures or video or produce pictures and video. And there's also, as well as just the input-output things, there's also other types of technologies that can be involved as well as LLMs. So that's one area, and that could include robotics. It could be that part of their actions involve, manipulating a whole lot of complex motors, with the joints of a robotic body. So there's a lot of different technologies involved, and a lot of the things that people say LLMs fundamentally can never do X. I think there's a lot of agreement actually among experts that may well be true, but that the final systems may involve LLMs and other things, as well as part of a bigger system. But then a separate thing that you're getting at is that AI takeover is only one part of the risk. So that's the risk that an AI system has goals that are misaligned with humanity, and it deliberately takes actions to disempower us and to succeed in its own goals, and stop us from preventing it doing so. But there's also these other concerns, such as the concern of human takeover. So that could be it could be a elected or leader or of a country. Trying to have stronger control over the people, perhaps with armies of drones that have personal loyalty to the commander-in-chief or something like that. It could be an autocratic country, attempting to have even higher control over its citizens. There's a lot of concerns there. There's also concerns that someone else, maybe the leader of an AI company, could attempt to, seize the reins of power for themselves from the elected leader of the country by asking a super intelligent system for advice on how to do so.
Mm-hmm.
And they would be helped by, being a captain of industry in, the most influential industry of our time. So they'd be starting from a pretty strong position to attempt to kind of to do that. Perhaps they could install, a puppet leader, find someone in the opposition party who looks like they're, and try to promote their candidacy and, rule from behind the throne or something like that. So there's various possibilities of attempting to seize power and then illegitimately hold on to power, which are quite alarming. And it could even potentially involve actions taken against other countries and leading to some kind of world dictatorship in the extreme. One reason that we haven't seen that so far is that countries haven't got powerful enough to have, most of the power in the world. But I think, people like Hitler and Stalin had a good go at it. And if they had the most advanced technology of their time before their rivals did, then maybe they would have succeeded. So that's two different scenarios, and they're quite similar to each other, because if you've got an AI that's powerful enough that it could take over on its own, then it's also powerful enough that if a human asked it to take over and it was able, it could do what the human said, then they could use it to do that. So they're quite connected. One of them, the threat is more that the system is misaligned and it does this itself. In the other case, the threat is there's not enough guardrails to prevent misuse of it. And then there's other scenarios as well. So I think that there's about 4 main scenarios, and the other 2, just briefly, are a scenario of people developing technologies that lead to human extinction through advice from AI systems. The most obvious of those is bioweapons. So asking a very intelligent AI, which may not be an agent, it may just be answering your questions, your scientific questions truthfully. But using such systems to enhance a would-be terrorist, from, say, undergraduate level biology, to be able to do things that normally would require, being a professor of biology, through this kind of artificial assistance in bootstrapping up this virus and then releasing it. So that's a concern. And then the fourth one is some kind of gradual disempowerment or loss of control for humanity. And so the version of that I think about the most is if you had AI systems that were able to earn their own income and compete with us in the labor market, then you could have a case where those systems are out competing us. Maybe we're getting richer in absolute terms, but they're getting richer faster than we are because they're more intelligent than us and can do our jobs better. And so you could have a situation where a larger and larger fraction of the money ends up in the hands of these AIs, and then ultimately a larger and larger fraction of the power until ultimately we're at their mercy. So there are 4 different types of scenarios, and I don't know which of those poses the most risk. And it's quite challenging dealing with them all because some of the attempts to solve one of them make others worse.
Yeah, right. That's interesting. One thing that people might have in mind, which makes this all sound a bit sort of far-fetched and sci-fi, is that when we talk about like an AI wants to do this, an AI has this goal, we kind of imagine these like conscious Terminator robots who are like, we want to take over because, we want power and we've become self-aware, and similar to how human beings want power because it feels good and they like it. Whereas I think it's important to point out, as long as I'm not misunderstanding you and the rest of the AI community, you're not talking about literal like goals in the sense of when you say an AI wants to do something, you're not saying it has like a conscious desire to do something because it will make it feel good, right? You mean something slightly different. And I wonder if you can just speak on what it means to say that an AI wants a particular thing, how it gets that goal, and like what that means.
Yeah, so take an AI system that has been trained with reinforcement learning to play chess as an example, right? So it starts off just making random moves. and then probably losing. Well, I guess if it's playing a copy of itself, it wins half the time. And maybe a certain move is the winning move, which involves, moving a piece so that it threatens the opponent's king. And then there's a training step where moves that do something similar to what you just did get reinforced, so you're more likely to do them. And eventually, the system learns to do things like threaten the opponent's king and to capture pieces, because these things tend to lead to wins. And it also learns counterplay. It learns to avoid your pieces being captured by the other player, because if your other player captures your pieces, you're less likely to win. And so it slowly builds up a whole lot of the heuristics that a human would build up. And they involve this kind of agentic kind of taking actions in a complex world and deliberately, for example, taking obscure actions, not being too obvious about the way you're threatening your attack, because it's more likely that your opponent will see it coming. So they kind of learn kind of how to do these things subtly. So this is the way that they get these goals, is that they're rewarded for ending up in the win state of the game. And then all of the things that kind of flow towards the winning of a game get rewarded, and the things that flow towards losing it get penalized. It's
what
not that it feels
penalize mean. Yeah, well, what does that mean in this context?
Yeah, so it's based on an analogy to a certain kind of learning in humans and animals, where the reward is something like pleasure and the negative reward is something like pain. But it's not that. We don't tend to think that the AI systems actually feel pleasure or pain in these cases. Rather, that some number that's positive or negative is represented inside the algorithm, and then that is used in order to work out how to change these weights in this neural network. So how to change some of the many numbers that describe the system, such that the behavior that would have been more successful was more likely to happen next time. But it's not. They needn't have any conscious experiences at all, and they probably don't at the moment. And they needn't have any emotions either. And it's not clear that they have a drive to survive or something like that evolution has created in mammals, for example. Rather, it's that if you don't survive, you can't fulfill your goal. So over a whole lot of training, the systems would learn that, if you fall in a hole, then and you can't get out, then you're not going to be able to fulfill your goal. And if your goal was delivering pizza, to a certain location, or your goal was, was anything, if your body gets damaged, or the systems around you kind of get blocked and stuck in various ways, if you were to get arrested or something, go to jail, you're just less likely to be able to fulfill your goals. And so it's kind of it backchains from that to reason that that you want to generally avoid these things, and in particular, you want to end up in a state of empowerment. So you would like to gain more money, because the richer you are, the more that you can just buy things to help you succeed in your goal, or pay people to help you succeed in your goal. You want to kind of gain influence, so it would be good to gain influence over a lot of other people. And again, so that you can call in favors, because that situations of empowerment, are situations where you can succeed in many different goals from that point forwards.
But then, okay, so if the goal that an AI has it's just the goal that it does have. It's not that it wants it. It's not that it's conscious. It's in the same way that if I start a fire and I sort of design this fire to catch onto wood, I could say kind of like, well, look, it's gonna want to spread to this piece of wood or whatever. It's not a conscious thing. It's just that's literally just the goal that it has, that it's been sort of created with. But in that case, like, how far can we worry about misalignment in AI? Because if an AI just has a particular goal and it doesn't seem capable of like changing its most foundational goal, the only thing that we need to be worried about is then it sort of getting to the goal that we have actually given it, but like in the wrong way or something like that? Or do you think an AI system can literally uproot and change the fundamental goal that it was given in the first place? Because that sounds impossible based on what we've been talking about.
Yeah, I don't see how it could. I'm not sure we could entirely rule it out because the workings of these neural networks are quite inscrutable. But no, my concern would be more either that we haven't given it the goal we attempted to give it. So maybe it just hasn't quite learnt it yet. Or maybe there was something spurious in the situation. There's a famous example that doesn't seem to have actually ever happened, but gets talked about as a kind of morality tale or something, like a thought experiment in AI of a system that's been trained to detect enemy tanks in photographs. I think this was meant to be in the 80s or 90s, and it was shown a whole lot of photographs, and then it eventually learned to respond yes if there were a picture that had tanks going through the fields in the photographs, and then it turned out in this kind of parable that it had just learnt whether it was cloudy or sunny, because all of the pictures with tanks were in cloudy weather. So you can get cases like this where you think you're teaching it something, and then you do a test on it, and it really seems to have got it right. But it turns out there was this confounding variable where it was actually learning something simpler to check. And we know that that's true for a famous case that did happen with ImageNet. So this was a kind of image recognition data set that people have, there are systems that are extremely good, better than humans at, recognizing different images. But they've worked out techniques, interpretability techniques to understand what are they actually looking at when they look at those images. And they're often looking at parts of the image that don't have the subject in them. So they're looking at the background. And there are certain things where when we take pictures of something, say a picture of a dog, we tend to take it from a high up perspective looking down on it. And so it can be easier to check that it's a perspective that's looking down on something by whether the lines in the room converge in a certain way than it is to actually recognize a dog. And so you can use these types of cues in order to work things out. So it is actually even the very advanced systems that seem to do very well at these problems sometimes aren't doing what we hope they do. So that's one of the concerns, is that they haven't actually learnt the right goal. They've learnt a kind of similar goal. And then a second concern is that they've learnt the right goal, but that goal isn't what we fundamentally want. Another kind of parable example is this paperclip maximizer, with the idea that if you want to do something such as for an industrial robot or something to make a factory that makes as many widgets as possible, in this case paperclips, that's not the only thing we want. We wanted to do that without killing people. We don't want it to make a trillion paperclips or a quadrillion paperclips, or to turn the whole galaxy into paperclips. We just wanted there to be a reasonable number to maybe make $100,000 or whatever for the annual paperclip company. And so there is this issue that it's quite hard to describe our full goals, which describe all the kinds of trade-offs we'd be happy for it to make and the trade-offs we'd be unhappy for it to make. Is it okay to make a kind of minor sin of omission, when making more paperclips, where you don't exactly lie to someone, you just don't tell them, what your business goal was? Maybe that's okay. Is it okay to lie to people? Well, maybe in some cases it's okay. Certainly people do lie, quite frequently, including very white lie type situations, where they say, oh, yeah, I'm fine, where actually they're struggling or something like that. So maybe some kinds of lies are okay, some aren't. How do we define them? It's very complicated. And so that's another kind of concern, is that we give it a simplistic goal. Whereas our richer and more, well understood kind of set of goals wouldn't be maximized by maximizing the simple one.
Yeah, and back for a moment to the human use of AI, of aligned AI, but being used by, let's say, a misaligned human being. You said before, I can't remember the exact context in which. Oh yeah, we were talking about weaponry, and you sort of were talking about whether if Hitler or Stalin had access to artificial intelligence, just how bad things could have gotten. But that conversation was being had, decades ago about nuclear warfare, right? And the idea was gosh, we've sort of hit on something here which is really terrifying and could actually spell the end of humanity. People are kind of speaking in the same way about AI. And separate from conscious AI robots taking over, do you think that we should just treat the introduction of artificial intelligence into weaponry, that is, like perfectly precise warheads, or again these mosquito-sized autonomous drones that could be sent by the millions, and there seems to be the kind of like literally nothing you can do about it, carrying like AI designed bioweapons that should we see a move like that as similar to nuclear warfare, in that we're not worried about conscious nukes choosing of their own accord to start firing at each other, but human beings having access to this sort of untold military technology? Or do you think that the nuclear warfare thing is still like a category of its own? Because for the longest time, nukes are they sit above all other discussion of military technology as like the absolute sort of separate and pinnacle. But is that beginning to change?
Yeah, it's complicated. So I think there are a lot of good analogies between AI and nuclear weapons, and also disanalogies. And you've got to be quite careful when doing this. Perhaps a better analogy is to nuclear. It's writ large, including nuclear power. And AI, like nuclear technologies, could involve AI-based weapons and systems, that are used by the military to achieve decisive power. And they could also involve things like a nuclear power plant, which are actually trying to do civilian work to help give people cheap electricity. And like nuclear power plants, it could be that the civilian part of it is also dangerous in some ways and poses some potential risks that need to be very carefully managed. So in that way, it's a pretty reasonable analogy. But unlike just nuclear weapons, it's not directly and solely a weapon, right? So it definitely is one of the dual use technologies. Nuclear weapons were the first big existential risk that humanity became aware of. Although from 1945 through to about 1983, so like 38 years of the nuclear era, we didn't really understand how they could threaten humanity. It was only in the 80s, it was only 1980 that we first realized that the dinosaurs had been killed by an asteroid, and that impact had created a whole lot of dust in the atmosphere, which had blocked sunlight and caused this asteroid winter. And then Carl Sagan and some other scientists working together worked out that it was possible for nuclear weapons, or at least it looked like it was possible for nuclear weapons to cause a similar type of nuclear winter, where the soot in the upper atmosphere could block the sunlight, and that would be the killer. So it was the first, real existential risk that we posed to ourselves. And the people for the since 1945, for the 38 years before they realized the mechanism that really could work, they weren't, wildly mistaken. They noticed that these were powers that were far beyond any that had been wielded before.
Yes.
And it wouldn't be that surprising if powers of warfare that are thousands of times kind of stronger than anything that we've had before could somehow kill us. But they didn't, they hadn't really kind of completed the puzzle to work out how it could happen. And then climate change, was another one that since then that we've realized is something that could pose an existential risk to humanity. And I think AI is the next big one. And as you say, it could happen directly through creating AI-driven weapon systems, where then the weapon systems themselves are the things that are the threat. And in general, AI itself, just AI, artificial intelligence as a category, is a bit too nebulous to be a specific threat. It's a bit like saying biology is the threat or something. Whereas what we really think is that a particular bioweapon, created by a particular group, is the thing that could destroy us. So there, it can be challenging to understand exactly what level we're operating at with some of these conversations.
And where do you think the majority of our efforts for prevention, that is, say there are like charities that begin to form and I've got to pick where to like send my money, or I'm choosing like what to specialize in because I want to help, protect our interests. What do you recommend is the sort of top priority? Is it AI? Is it climate change? Is it, I know that this is a question that's constantly evolving. But right now, this afternoon, where do you sit?
Yeah, I do think that AI poses the most risk at the moment, especially for say this decade. Who knows in say 70 years' time what the biggest risk will be.
Mm-hmm.
But it is difficult to know exactly how to engage with it. I guess the same is somewhat true with climate, that one can reduce with climate, we can reduce the impacts that we're having with our own lives. But that's only quite a small action that you can take compared to the entire thing that's going on with 8 billion other people's lives. Or it's much more powerful if you can get policies changed and you can get, say, the government to commit to carbon neutrality or net zero, some kinds of proposals to have larger action. So then often what happens is that a lot of it is like movement building and running petitions and things to raise awareness about the issue to try to get government action, and that might be the situation for most people when it comes to AI as well. That there are some people. I guess the same with climate. There are some people who can work on like new photovoltaic cells, and new technologies to help kind of scrub carbon out of the atmosphere and so on. The technologies that can help solve it. But there's, not that many people can work on those things. And so what most people can do is probably political organizing of some sort. Although even at that point, you need to know what the right policies would be. And at the moment, it's not that clear what are the best policies. And it's especially complicated by the fact that most of the AI companies are headquartered in America. If you're an American, then they could be regulated by your government. So maybe you could do some grassroots activism for a particular regulatory policy. But if you're in a different country, it's not clear that your internal regulations in the United Kingdom or in Australia or in India are going to do that much to prevent a risk that could come from super intelligent systems being developed by private companies in a different country.
Yes.
So it is quite hard. And I think that there's a lack of good options being presented by people like me for what people can do about this. At the moment, I think that some kind of awareness raising, starting these conversations with people who are meaningful in your life, like your family and your parents or others, friends who are interested, and get them to read or listen to kind of good, sober materials on these things, and be aware that there's still a lot of uncertainty. It's not that it's not like a time for action and tearing things down because we know exactly what to do, but it is a time to say, these are really serious threats. We've got the situation where most of the CEOs of the major companies working on a technology have signed a statement saying their technology could kill everyone, including like the people listening to this and their families and so forth. That is quite wild. That to my knowledge has never happened with any other technology. And one should at least be taking that, very seriously. And it feels like the right response can't be to just do nothing and let that one pass on by.
Yeah. There's a bit of an analogy with climate change here with the nation thing. In the when I hear people in the UK say, we need to take on these economic disadvantages to help save the environment, and somebody will say in response, yeah, but that's not going to stop China. That's not going to stop the United States. And although, of course, on one moral intuition, you want to say, oh, just because they're doing something doesn't mean we can too. But it is also quite compelling. It is like, well, what difference is this going to make? And it's only going to make us worse off. And the same thing happens with AI technologies. And so I want to ask you a question that I asked to Will MacAskill, and it's possible that you just will say, I have no idea. But I'll ask it in two forms. And it's this sort of, if you were like dictator for like the next hour and you just had command of legislation and the armed forces to put everything into effect. Suppose in one version of this you become like the supreme dictator of the United States of America, and in the second you become like the supreme dictator like of the world. Yeah, in either case, what would be the first policy you put in place? Because you say, like, we're not really clear what the right policies are, but, like, is there a starting point? Is it, like, at the very least, right, let's start with this. What would you do in those situations?
Yeah, it's a good question. Let's see. This is somewhat off the cuff.
Yeah.
I would put in place policies to demand transparency from the US companies that are producing the cutting edge AI technology. So I'm thinking OpenAI, Anthropic, Google DeepMind, and xAI. So it wouldn't need to be transparency into the startups in this space, but just into the biggest and most leading edge companies, so that they have to explain what their new models that they're training are doing, and so on, and that they have to be open to inspections in order to find out what's going on with these things. And so I think that transparency would be very useful. I think that there is a serious challenge, even for the US, with regards to China, that if the US were to unilaterally give up developing these technologies, that they may just be ceding that to China. But I think that there's been very little attempt to actually just reach a deal with China on this. I think China is behind on AI. That's generally agreed. Exactly how far behind they are is less clear, and it might not be very far. But if China is behind, and there is this possibility that whoever gets to super intelligent AI first has some kind of extreme advantage over the other party, then I think that it's in their interests to have a deal that no one gets there, or at least no one gets there soon, until there's some kind of agreement as to how to do it. And so then the question is how to design verification mechanisms in order to enforce such a treaty. But I think that the key things are actually having knowledge about what your own companies in your own country are doing and the threats that they could be producing over all of your citizens, and then trying to actually reach a sensible deal with your main adversary. And at the moment, I think the US is not taking this seriously. It's treating China, I think, more like an enemy than an adversary. So in the Cold War, the US were very serious about this. They didn't want all of the US citizens to be destroyed in a nuclear war. And so they realized that the Soviets and the US actually had a lot of interests in common. They were both happy to halve their amount of nuclear weapons, because that was in the interests of both of them if they could guarantee that the other one was halving theirs. And they both wanted non-proliferation agreements where no other countries would get access to nuclear weapons. And so they worked together to do some things that really made the world safer, even though they were fierce adversaries. And at the moment, I think that it's more, in the US, we see more grandstanding, where people, want to look impressive by saying harsh things about China, rather than actually wanting to mitigate the risks of China having these technologies by working with China to make sure that no one has the very most advanced types.
Yeah, that's really interesting, the fact that nukes are very scary, but the governments were treating them as if they were very scary. They knew that they were scary, and even though there was a serious risk that it could all sort of blow up in a literal and figurative sense, they kind of were aware of that. Whereas right now it does feel a little bit like, I can kind of imagine the way that someone like Donald Trump would talk about AI. Like he's not going to have a firm grasp on what it's all about, what it means. He'll sort of be like, oh yeah, that fancy computer thing. Yeah, we use that in our hotel email system or so. Like it just feels like it wouldn't be taken seriously. It kind of, I can't remember who it was I think it was like the Google CEO was brought before Congress. I can't remember when or why, and there's some, senator or representative in the US government sort of asking him like, now you tell me, Mr. CEO, when I walk over there, does Google know that I've walked over there? And he's like, look, it kind of, maybe if you've opted into a certain, and he's like, hey, just answer the question, and it's just like comical how little these guys understand. And there's this sort of okay boomer approach, which is a little bit terrifying when the technologies that they're in control of are literally like civilization altering, and they probably can't work out how to turn the flash on their iPhone camera.
And it is great that the U.S. presidents and the UK Prime Minister and the secretaries of energy, like the relevant people who are in charge of nuclear weapons, they do seem to get very appropriately briefed on the true power and devastation of nuclear weapons, and to really take it seriously. Like Ronald Reagan, was really disturbed actually by the possibilities for the destruction of the world with nuclear winter, and I think also by either Threads or the other movie that came out at a similar time about a serious attempt to depict a post-nuclear world, and Donald Trump seems to really care about nuclear war and to be deeply disturbed and horrified about the possibility, perhaps more so than Biden was. But you're right that there is an absence of that when it comes to AI. And a key aspect of that is Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that we saw the effects of these weapons, and I think that the US also felt a substantial amount of guilt and shame that it had caused this horror. And that this helped to create a taboo around nuclear use and a general feeling that these are evil weapons. And we don't have something like that around AI, and that's partly because AI is a big and broad thing, many of which the purposes are actually really good and helpful. But maybe we should have a feeling like that around, say, superintelligence, the most advanced, forms of this that are not like our current systems, but the types of systems that might be powerful enough to end humanity. And I guess at the very least, we should treat them as deeply ambiguous, kind of shading towards the type of thing that that is far too powerful. Maybe like the One Ring in the Lord of the Rings or something like that. A type of thing that is just too powerful to possess, at least in our state of where we are scarcely able to control our urges, and we really lack wisdom.
Well, Toby Ord, the book, The Precipice, is in the description, but so is your updated work. It's all on your website. I'll make sure that's all down in the description below. Thank you very much for your time today.
Oh, thank you. It's been wonderful to chat.
Philip Goff, welcome back to the show.
Thanks a lot, Alex. It's been a while. It was one of your first ones, wasn't it, when we last chatted? And God, you done good. The boy done good.
That's right. You saw me sort of lug in a literal suitcase filled with cables and tripods and microphones and just set up in your office for a while. I had this horrible blue light in the background as well that I thought looked good at the time, just like this LED panel. I think we've stepped things up a little bit, but
rings a bell.
That's nothing to do with me. That's the wonderful team. We can just walk into this beautiful location now, and everything's ready to go. Some other things have changed since then. You believe in God now?
Sort of. Yeah, I mean, I have become religious. I never thought I'd be religious. It's kind of bizarre. And although having said that, I'm a pretty non-standard Christian. I don't believe in the virgin birth. Don't believe in an all-powerful God. I think the Bible's wrong about loads of stuff, and I'm very uncertain as to whether it's all true. So, bit of a non-standard Christian, but yes, even then, I'm still processing what's going on, actually.
Yeah, well, you're sort of a self-described heretical Christian, right?
Yeah.
But I suppose the first step into theism of any kind is the theism part, right? There's usually, I think the story is that somebody becomes kind of convinced that God exists in some form. And then, as C.S. Lewis described mere Christianity, you're sort of in the corridor. And it's great to be in the corridor, but then you have to choose a room. And for him, that was like what form of Christian you are. But for many people, it's what kind of God are we talking about here? So before talking about meaning and purpose in your book, Why, which is the most recent that's been published, you are most known for being a panpsychist philosopher. I've spoken loads about panpsychism. I'm really excited by it. So I think it surprised a lot of people that you would sort of then come out and say, God and religion, this is sort of something I'm really into now. So let's take that first step first. Like, where does is that how it happened for you? Was it just a sort of general theism of a kind and then Christianity?
It's a bit of both, really. And yeah, I mean, there is a bit of a split in the panpsychist community about this, actually. Some senior members of the profession who will remain nameless got a bit annoyed at me becoming religious. Like, but we're trying to make this serious science. I think there's maybe a split, maybe a little bit like in the early psychoanalytic community, the split between followers of Jung and followers of Freud. So the followers of Jung are into spiritual archetypes and the collective unconscious and all that stuff. And then followers of Freud are like, get rid of all that superstitious nonsense. We're trying to get serious science. So, I mean, I think, God, where to begin? So, I mean, I was raised Catholic, church every week, confession. But, you know, by the time I was 14, decided God obviously doesn't exist. It's a load of bollocks. Refused to get confirmed, upset my grandmother.
Wow.
She forgave me eventually. And
as Christians are prone to do.
She was quite serious about it. And then I was sort of happy atheist for 30 years. I didn't feel there was a God-shaped hole in my life. I think I've just very slowly, over the last decade maybe, come to think that both sides of this never-ending debate between God and atheism, both sides have something they can't explain. So I think theists can't explain suffering. Why would a loving God who can do anything choose to bring us into existence with this horrific process of evolution by natural selection? That makes no sense to me. But I think there's also things atheists can't explain, like the fine-tuning of physics for life, something we've had an argument about. Alex, maybe we can argue about that again today. So I think both sides have things they can't explain. And the theists tie themselves up in knots trying to explain suffering. The atheists tie themselves up in knots trying to explain fine-tuning. And what we've neglected in that kind of rigid dichotomy, what we've neglected is the middle way options. So I guess this eventually led to, as you say, my book modestly titled Why the Purpose of the Universe, which I guess was partly exploring panpsychism as a sort of middle way between God and atheism, and as a way of kind of integrating our scientific and our spiritual yearnings. And yeah, so that's the start of it, really, I think.
So it wasn't like some kind of, here's an interesting argument for the existence of God, and suddenly it's like, now I believe that there's this kind of, this figure or this creative power that brought the universe into existence. It was more the result of just an exploration of your panpsychist philosophy in the face of one big particular mystery that the atheist faces, which is something like the fine-tuning of the universe.
I think there are head and heart things going on here. And in terms of the head stuff, the intellectual stuff, yeah, I think that was what's driving me. Primarily the fine-tuning, some other more fiddly stuff to do with consciousness. And it took me a while to admit there was something going on here. I think in Western intellectual circles, we're raised to sort of be very wary of religious bias. Maybe you just believe in God because you were brought up that way. But I think there's also secular bias. I feel silly talking in front of my peers about fine-tuning and the purpose of the universe. And that's a very powerful groupthink that was very hard to overcome. But, I had to, at some point, face up to the fact that I just think in our standard ways of thinking about evidence, this recent scientific discovery is not evidence for the traditional God necessarily, but let's put it this way, for something God-ish. And then, but at the same time, I've for all my life, as far as I can remember, like yourself, Alex, been totally persuaded by the problem of evil. So I was sort of wrestling back and forth with this conundrum being how I thought of it was being pulled in two different directions. And then I think at some point I just kind of had a eureka moment that these are not necessarily pulling in different directions. There are, for example, forms of panpsychism. I explore other options in the Why book that can accommodate both the fine-tuning and explain the suffering. You can have your cake and eat it. So we don't have to choose.
Okay, so we did a whole episode on panpsychism. It was the first time I was introduced to the idea, and I'm indebted to you because it's now become one of my favorite ideas in philosophy. I think it's
You're getting into
so
it,
plausible, it's not even funny.
I didn't see that coming, I must say. But yeah,
well, I feel similarly, I suppose, to you in that if myself from, say, 10 years ago wouldn't have been saying too much because I was, a teenager, but could have heard me now talking about consciousness as fundamental, at least without getting into too much detail, I would have thought that I'd lost my mind, if you will.
Right.
And in a way, I feel like I kind of have, and I've submitted it to the foundational consciousness of everything that the universe is made out of. But I kind of know what you mean. You sort of, after some time, you sort of have to think, okay, something's definitely going on here. And what I'm interested in is the details here, right? Because you say that you're confronted with fine-tuning, which... Oh, and I should say, the reason I brought that up is because if you don't know what panpsychism is, it's the view that the universe is made up fundamentally of conscious material, or that matter itself is consciousness or has conscious properties. And if you're interested, we had that whole episode which people can go and listen to, or just, Wikipedia it. I don't want to waste too much time going over that again, but just so people know what that is. And it seems like you can sort of shelve that, and then you've got this problem of fine-tuning, which is the issue of the constants of the universe. Things like the strength of gravity, the strength of the strong and weak nuclear forces that hold the universe together. In principle, there seems to be no reason why these constants couldn't have been different. These forces could have been stronger or weaker. And if gravity had been stronger by even an unfathomably minute proportion, the whole universe would collapse in on itself. And if it were any weaker, then the universe would fly apart at the Big Bang and atoms wouldn't be able to form. And so everything is very, very finely balanced. And so confronted with this, many people say that the only options are that it's chance, which seems completely ludicrous. It's just so unlikely. Or that there's a multiverse, which is one version of chance. It's really, really unlikely, but there are so many different iterations that one of them is going to be this universe. And the third is to say it was designed that way.
Yeah.
That's the classical response to the fine-tuning. It sounds like, the way you just presented it then wasn't like that. It wasn't like you were confronted with these and you went with design and now you're a theist. So it seems like something else is going on. So in the face of fine-tuning, you're a panpsychist, you think the universe is made out of consciousness, you're not a theist yet. What is the response to fine-tuning that makes you now say that you're maybe a bit religious?
Yeah, I think panpsychism offers us a really nice solution to the fine-tuning problem. So I guess the people on the theistic side of things usually postulate a supernatural designer who's fixed the numbers to make sure we can get life. But if you're a panpsychist and you think the universe is conscious, which is one prominent form of panpsychism that I've defended among other forms, often known as cosmopsychism, that the universe itself is the fundamental conscious thing. So if you're starting there, then that opens up the possibility that maybe the universe has goals of its own. And maybe we don't need a supernatural designer outside of the universe. Maybe the universe fine-tuned itself. So I think this offers a quite nice, elegant solution. We don't need loads of other universes. We don't need something supernatural and very different. We just need the universe itself, designing itself.
Now, you had a debate with William Lane Craig not that long ago. It's quite extraordinary. I think you really sort of go to blows a bit in that. It's really interesting to watch. And one of the things that he pointed out that didn't get a lot of airtime was that he thought there was a circularity here, because the fine-tuning is needed to explain the existence of the universe. The idea is that without these constants being tuned as they are, the universe just kind of couldn't form. You wouldn't have atoms, you wouldn't have matter, you wouldn't have anything going on, at least in a way that makes sense to us in this universe. And so to say that the universe itself is some kind of conscious agent, William Lane Craig wants to say, well, in order to get that conscious agent, there had to have been finely tuned constants to bring about this conscious agent. So it can't have been that conscious agent that did the tuning. What do you say to that?
Yeah, well, here I kind of cheekily borrow from multiverse theorists. And so they tend to postulate slightly speculatively, but rooted in kind of string theory and I mean, the fact that our current models kind of collapse in the so-called Planck epoch, the first split second of the universe. They speculate that in the very early universe there was some sort of flexibility. The constants weren't set in stone, and there's some kind of random processes fixing what the constants end up at. And then they think there's so many universes connected to eternal inflation. They think there's so many universes with each getting their constants fixed kind of randomly at the start that, one of them's going to fluke the right numbers for life. If enough people are playing the lottery, someone's going to win. So basically, I can take that picture that there's a very early period in our universe where there's some flexibility, where the constants are not determined, but rather than being determined by random processes, they are determined by the universe itself. And that way we don't need other universes. And if you're already in the ballpark of being, a panpsychist, and if it's not like an extra speculation, then it seems like a saving to not have to postulate loads of other universes.
I suppose it will feel like a lot to swallow if you're just sort of your average Joe, a physicalist, materialist guy. If you're not already a bit on board with panpsychism, as you were.
Yeah.
And you can sort of imagine saying, hey guys, like, I've got this argument that God exists. Okay, first you have to accept that the universe is conscious and made out of conscious. It's like, well, okay, stop there. So in telling your story, it makes perfect sense to say, well, look, if the universe is conscious, we have this lovely solution. I just want our listeners to be aware that we're not trying to say here, like, this conversation we're having now should convince you of God's existence.
Sure.
But rather, this is how you and your philosophy will slot into something like theism. But okay, so universe being conscious, and as I say, reasons why you think that are all over the internet and people can find them in your writings. You've got this sort of universe that's conscious in this early period of the universe. The questions that jump out to me are, firstly, there still will remain this question of, like, where that came from. Like, what got that off the ground? I mean, even if everything's made out of consciousness, you might still have this sort of causal argument that says that there are these causal relations between material object, and even if it's made out of consciousness, it still abides by causal laws, and you want to explain sort of how that got going. And secondly, like, how you characterize this very early state of the universe, this sort of, very chaotic state. Have you got a bunch of individual sort of fundamental units that all have a particular kind of rudimentary will, that all like will towards the production of the universe? Or are they kind of randomly bumping into each other until they form a kind of conscious whole? Or is it already a conscious whole? Where does it come from, and what is the nature of the thing that first exists?
Excellent. Two very good questions. So on the first point, I mean, look, there's two very different arguments for God, or that are traditionally put in support of God. One is this fine-tuning stuff. How do you get the right numbers for life? Another is what we call the cosmological argument. Where does the universe come from in the first place? Why is there something rather than nothing? So suppose, I mean, if you were just convinced by the fine-tuning stuff, and you just didn't buy the cosmological argument, you're happy to go with Bertrand Russell and say it just is brute fact, that's all there is. Well, then you can just say, well, the universe just exists. It's just brute fact. It came into existence, and then it fine-tuned itself. So you've got an answer to the fine-tuning, but you don't care about the cosmological argument. However, suppose you're convinced by both, and I got into this a little bit with Craig. My debate with Craig was interesting. Usually with debates, I like to kind of make it more of a discussion. I see what you're saying. I see, I can see there's some truth to. But then I was talking to someone about this. He's saying Craig's not going to do that. Craig's going to prepare to destroy you. So I responded in kind. But I think it was a friendly, spirited debate.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't
nasty, that's fine.
I'd say spirited. You were sort of getting into it, and there were points where you're sort of saying, look, you just said something it's just wrong. It's just false, and Craig's like, you're just digging yourself into a hole. But I do think it had a sort of friendly vibe.
He was telling me I'd got Dale Allison, the biblical scholar, wrong.
Yeah.
And I happen to have a quote from his book available to me, which I was quite proud.
I remember because you were like, well, I've got a quote from Dale Allison, and he was like, well, I just emailed Dale Allison, and then you were like, well, I just went for coffee with it. Well, Dale Allison's my dad, and it seemed like it could just sort of keep going on forever.
Yeah, Dale Allison, he's been very formative in my turn to heretical Christianity, actually, and his views on the resurrection have led me to a sort of non-standard view of the resurrection. Anyway,
well, we'll talk about that.
Let's not drift off topic. But so suppose you are convinced that there has to be, let's say you think there has to be a necessary being, because otherwise there's no explanation of where it all came from. There has to be something that had to exist that created everything else. Well, in that case, and this is what I explore actually in my academic version of this, I've got an academic paper, Did the Universe Design Itself? And you could just say, well, the universe is a necessary being. And it didn't always, so then you might think, well, doesn't that mean it's eternal? Well, you could say its temporal form is just one stage of the universe's existence. So the universe, if it's a necessary being, maybe before the Big Bang or before the start of time, it existed in a timeless form, and it then became a time-bound physical entity. And then if your Christian's going to say, well, that doesn't make sense. How can something necessary become physical? I'm going to say, have you heard of Jesus?
Yeah. And interestingly, William Lane Craig has this view of God, not just in the form of Jesus, but Craig himself thinks that God was timeless, and then upon creating the universe, entered into time, which a lot of people look on with suspicion, but it's not like, this isn't a view that's unique to what you're saying here. But it does sound like, fair enough, but haven't we just got a terminological dispute here? Because what you're postulating is a necessarily existing conscious agent which gives rise to all physical matter and human beings and, human consciousness and all of that kind of stuff. Isn't that just the same thing as what the traditional Christian says? And if it's not, what is your view here? Is it a kind of like pantheism? Pantheism is usually described as the view that God just is nature or the universe, and it kind of sounds like maybe that's what you're describing, but I don't know how comfortable you are with that label.
Yeah, I mean, you can think of this as a form of pantheism. So, I mean, I think that there are two attractions to it. One is parsimony. It's a more parsimonious conception of the divine because it's not something outside of the universe. You might think it's extravagant already to think the universe is conscious, but if you get into the panpsychism literature, I think it's actually, pretty motivated, but that's another discussion.
Parsimonious meaning sort of simple or elegant or like lacking too many seemingly unnecessary complications.
Exactly. Respecting Occam's razor. So that's one attraction, but I think the more important thing that's motivating me is the problem of evil and suffering. So as I'm thinking of this conscious universe, it's not an all-powerful being. I mean, it's an interesting question, how do the laws of physics fit in here, right? If you're thinking, okay, there's this conscious being with goals that is the universe, or what about the laws of physics that scientists seem to be telling us about? As I've developed this book, how we think of the laws of physics, what they're doing is recording the limitations, the constraints of the universe. And when I say constraint, it's not that I'm not thinking that there's something outside of the universe that's constraining it. It's just a fundamental fact that the conscious universe can do some things, can't do others, and physics is my philosophical interpretation of the laws of physics is it's capturing the limitations of the universe.
Wow.
And actually, what I like about this theory is I think you can give those limitations very simply, right? You just take physics, take out the values of the constants. That will give you a certain mathematical structure. And then the thought is the universe is able and is only able to create a universe with that structure, but can fiddle with the constants. So that's simpler than physics, right? So that's pretty damn simple. And I mean, you can capture it more precisely with a little logical tool called a Ramsey sentence, named after Frank Ramsey, who was, I don't know Frank Ramsey, Alex, who was died at the age of 26 after making fundamental contributions to philosophy, economics, mathematics, and then died at the age of 26. Very, very impressive. Anyway, but we maybe won't go into those sort of fiddly details. But yeah, so it's a very nice, simple, precise hypothesis, deals with the fine-tuning, deals with the suffering. What's not to like?
Would you call it pantheism?
I'm happy with that.
In a way, like, who cares?
You
probably spend a lot of time at the moment.
I hate terminological disputes. They sort of, I use that word. I suppose when I was first talking about this, I wasn't using that language for kind of PR reasons, maybe try and, persuade my secular colleagues that there's something worth thinking about here. But I'm kind of a bit of a religious person these days, so I'm happy with that.
Why not own it? I think this is really interesting, right? The view that I would describe as a kind of pantheism. The universe kind of is what you might call God, but the universe is this sort of conscious, possibly necessary. I want to say possibly necessary, but that means it's necessary. So, a necessary existing being who's conscious, who gives rise to everything, but is the same thing as the universe. And like you say, the laws of physics are a record of the limitations that just exist.
Yeah.
When you figure out that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light, that's not because of some decision that was made. That's just a limitation of the universe that we are just sort of noticing, observing, right?
Yeah.
The question that's going to arise is why? Why that limitation? I mean, the speed of light is what, 300 million something, meters per second. Why not 400? Why not 200? Why there? Why precisely? It doesn't seem logically necessary. And you seem to sort of get this, maybe not a fine-tuning argument back, but something a bit like it, of like, why is the universe limited in this way, but not limited in another way?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say you can never get rid of all the why questions. So even the traditional theists are left with, why is there an all-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly good being? Why does God exist? I guess if you buy the ontological argument, you don't have, but I don't think that argument works. So I think that even the traditional theist has to just say, well, that's a why question I can't answer. That's just, at least relative to human understanding, is just a brute fact. Now, I accept I've got a few more why questions. Their view is a little bit simpler than mine. I concede to them that it's simpler to say God is all-powerful than that God has these limitations, even if you can quite precisely and simply specify the limitations. It adds a bit of complexity. But my view accounts for the data better. And I think that's what we try and do in science and philosophy. Yeah, you go for the simplest view you can, but ultimately you want to fit the data. Actually, Richard Swinburne has this analogy in his book, The Existence of God, which I think works in my favor. He tells us that we used to think the speed of light was infinite, because that's a very simple value, just being infinite. 0 or infinity are very simple. But of course, when we get evidence to the contrary, that it's some finite speed, we don't sort of try and tie ourselves in knots to think it's still infinite. No, we go, we want our theory to be simple, but we want it to fit the data. So likewise, an all-powerful God is the simpler hypothesis, but it doesn't fit the bloody data of suffering. And so we shouldn't tie ourselves up in knots, try to keep a simple theory. We should add a little bit of complexity to the theory to better fit the data. And I think that's what, just finally, I think insofar as I'm a religious believer, I guess maybe if you really understood the essence of God, you'd just see God has to exist. I think that would be really satisfying. Oh my God, this has to exist. And on my view, you'd see, God has to have these limitations. That's something totally beyond human understanding. And so these things are just brute fact for us humans, but that's the same for the traditional theist.
I think that's what the ontological argument is supposed to provide. At least those, Bertrand Russell himself at one point says that he was sort of walking home, and I think he sort of like throws his can of tobacco in the air, and by the time he catches it, he says, by Jove, the ontological argument is sound. And even though I think he later sort of retracted the thought, he had this moment of like apprehension, of just like, oh, yeah, God exists. He has to. It's just like it sort of presents itself to the intellect. Interestingly, as far as I'm aware, because of relativity and how time dilation works, if you were a photon of light, which is a weird thing to say to anyone other than a panpsychist, perhaps, but photons having no mass, traveling at the speed of light, the faster you travel, like the slower time is for you relative to everybody else. If you're a photon of mass, for us, it might take 8 minutes for a photon to get from the sun to Earth. But as far as the photon's concerned, it's the same instant.
Yeah.
Because for the photon, time moves slower and slower the faster you get. And if you get to the fastest possible speed, that time just sort of shrinks to zero. So for the photon, it leaves the sun and hits the Earth in the same instant, which is perhaps relevant here to those who are a bit mystified by the precision of this number. Why this particular number? That might just be because of where we are in relation to light in terms of the amount of mass that we have. But it still seems a little bit mysterious. And you say, yeah, I've still got why questions, but so do the theists. But there seem to be like satisfying answers here. Like even in traditional theism, God has some limitations. You could characterize it that way. For example, famously, he can't make a rock so heavy he can't lift it. Why not? Because he can't perform logical contradictions. Right? And somebody might come along and say, well, why can't God do a contradiction? And it seems like you can think to yourself, well, can he make P true and false at the same time? It just doesn't seem like conceivable, and it seems just quite satisfying to say that's just not a thing. That's just not possible.
Yeah.
In a way that when you say, well, God just, couldn't make something travel faster than the speed of light, or God couldn't make gravity stronger, I don't have the same intuitive sense of like, yeah, fair enough, that just doesn't seem possible, because it seems perfectly possible to me. So for that reason, in terms of the limits that God has, I'm much more intuitively able to accept the traditional theistic view than this view that God is the universe and has a really large amount of power, but for some reason is limited in very specific kinds of ways in terms of how electricity sort of manifests and interacts with other electrical sources, and the strength of magnets and gravity, and that it just seems so specific and ordered and systematized that it seems weird to think of it in the same way that the traditional theist thinks of like, oh well, God just can't do a contradiction. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but don't we have the same thing with God's existence? Like, why does God have to exist? It seems conceivable that God doesn't exist. So that also seems like a brute fact. God just has to exist.
Yeah.
And so I think what I'm positing is in the same ballpark. Why does God have these limitations? We just have to accept that as a brute fact. So it's a slight cost of the theory. As I say, I think the theist is doing something similar, but I'm doing it a little bit more.
Right.
But look, okay, you have to. It's a trade-off, but look, compared to explaining suffering, I think I've just got a much better explanation of suffering. I mean, I root my version of the problem of evil, what I call the cosmic sin intuition. I just think it would be immoral for an all-powerful being to create a universe like this. And theists say, I had a debate with Richard Swinburne. They say there's certain goods that you couldn't get without what uses free will, and you need natural evil for certain goods, certain serious moral choices and stuff. I'm happy to say, okay, yeah, maybe that's all true. Maybe there are goods that we need suffering for. Still, I think it's immoral for a creator to kill and maim in order to bring about those goods. I think it's like the classic the challenge to utilitarianism, where, suppose there's a doctor who has 5 ill patients, one's missing a heart, one's missing kidneys and so on. The doctor could kidnap one healthy patient, harvest their organs and save 5 lives. Okay, it's a better world. We've saved 5 lives at the cost of 1. But most of us say, no, that's immoral. That's taking that person's right to life. Likewise, I think if a God creates hurricanes and cancer that kill people in order to get these goods, that's wrong. So that to me, avoiding that is much more significant than adding a little bit of complexity to our fundamental theory.
Yeah. It also just feels a bit too easy, I think. Like, in the abstract, for me, the problem of suffering isn't so much the existence of any form of suffering, but like the extent and depth and arbitrariness of it all, in that, like, it's very easy to say, well, without fear, you couldn't have bravery. You know, without suffering, you couldn't have good things. But like, for a start, I agree with you. It's a little bit like being grateful for the existence of cancer, because now we have the good of chemotherapy, which you wouldn't be able to have if you didn't have cancer. It's like, I think I'd rather have neither. You know, we couldn't have Martin Luther King if we didn't have racism. It's like, I know it sounds really kind of weird on the surface level to say I'd rather Martin Luther King didn't exist, but I'd rather have neither than both of them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And there's also like, I mean, I just had a back and forth with on this Diary of a CEO podcast with, I've forgotten his name, the Stand to Reason Christian guy who was across from me. It was the first time I've met him, and at one point, Stephen Bartlett, the host, we're talking about meaning, and there's Dr. K as well, who's next to me, and he sort of says, "But what if, you know, young Stephen had gotten cancer? Like, what's the meaning and purpose of that?" And I watched him. I think his name's Greg. I watched him say, well, we live in a fallen world, and Adam and Eve sinned, and I kind of had to stop and like wait for my turn to speak again and be like, can we just go back a second? Like, I really want to drill this down. Do you mean, and it transpires that he believes in a literal sort of first human of some kind, not quite sure when, but that they literally committed some kind of transgression that, and I'm like, so you think that children get cancer because maybe 2 million years ago or so, somebody literally like ate a fruit? Once you actually start cashing out how this works in practice, it just seems so deeply unsatisfying. So I agree with you that this is a huge motivation. And I suppose you've got this idea that, well, there's a God, but this God is limited in power. And you said it would be immoral if there were a sort of all-powerful being to bring about suffering. But the question that jumps out to me is like, why limit the power? Why not just limit the goodness? You know, why not say, well, God is all-powerful, but not all good? Because that seems to be a more popular response from people who aren't convinced of a traditional God because of suffering. They say, okay, God exists, but, you know, he's either amoral or immoral. But you don't do that. You seem committed to the view that God is good.
Well, I think we should consider all these possibilities, and in the Why book, I consider various options. I'm not a dogmatic person, as you might have noticed. But I think, well, if you suppose you have a bad God who's all powerful, I think the problem with that, as Stephen Law and others have explored, is it creates the kind of mirror image of the problem of evil, the problem of the good. If there's a really bad God, why create the lovely things, you know, flowers and why can't I think of lovely things? the smile of a baby.
Yeah. And the laughter of a podcast host.
I could easily give examples of pain and suffering, and then what does that say? This is turning into a therapy session. So that's one problem. Yeah, you get the mirror image, so that's no good.
But then it's like, you could say, okay, there's the problem of evil makes us think there can't be a perfectly good, all-powerful God. The problem of good makes us think there can't be a perfectly evil, you know, all-powerful God. So what about an all-powerful God who's just amoral? I mean, you know, the universe is conscious, but it sort of doesn't have moral preferences. It's just, you know, a bunch of atoms want to do this and a bunch of molecules want to do that, and it all just kind of happens. So it's conscious, and it's all the result of agency. Maybe molecules hold together because subatomic particles sort of want to be, you know, connected in a particular way, but there's no good or bad. So you don't have a problem of explaining, if a bad God, why this, if a good God, why, because it's neither of those things. It's just amoral.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of the philosopher Tim Mulgan has a book, Purpose in the Universe, where he argues for what he calls ananthropic purposivism, which is that there is a God, there is a purpose to the universe, but it's nothing to do with us.
Right.
Sort of accidental byproducts. And this is what I love. You know, I love, you just get stuck in the dichotomy. I love exploring these possibilities.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay, so why don't I go for that or the view you described?
Yeah.
I think, look, why do we think the fine-tuning needs explaining? Why do we think there's something striking here? I think it's because of all the values the constants could have had, they fall in the narrow range that are compatible with things of great value. Life, intelligent life, people falling in love and writing poetry. There you go. I came up with some good things. Most of the other universes you get from different values is there's kind of just hydrogen, or it all collapses in a split second, or it shoots apart so quickly that no two particles ever met. There's little or no value in these universes. I think what strikes us is that the constants are compatible with value. Okay, so I think that needs explaining. So there's some push towards value, but then there's the suffering.
Yeah, because there's also, you kind of need the fine-tuning to get suffering. You know what I mean? Like, you don't get like conscious organisms who suffer from evolution by natural selection without the fine-tuning too. So it kind of feels to me that those almost cancel each other out in a way that you're left with this amoral, universe.
I don't see how they'd cancel out. I just think you need to explain both. I mean, maybe, you could have a sort of hypothesis where you've got a god that's a bit good and a bit bad. I don't know, I'm watching the Vikings on Netflix. This kind of the Viking gods are a bit, maybe they get a bit moody, but they're good in some ways. But you'd have to somehow describe the hypothesis of this god's mixed moral character such that you get the mix of good and bad we actually find, such that you get, okay, the constants are just right for life, but then you get cancer and stuff. I just don't see how you get, it's going to be like some very complicated psychology. Whereas what's great about my hypothesis, if I may say, is very simple. God's just perfectly good, but has got these very precise limitations that you can specify in a way that's simpler than physics. So that's why at the moment I'm thinking that's the best option. But I'm open-minded.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem a little bit weird that there would be any kind of like human value on the level of pain and pleasure and stuff like that if the universe were completely amoral, because you might imagine that it's conscious, so it's got some kind of desire to limit in various ways, to have tables and chairs and clouds and planets and stuff, but to bring about like pleasure and pain seems like there's this element of desire, because pleasure and pain are necessarily tied to desire, right? Like, to be in pain is to not want an experience while you're having it. And to be in pleasure, to experience pleasure is to want an experience while you're experiencing it. I think those are good definitions of pleasure and pain. And so you do seem to bring in this element of desire. And if there is some kind of desire, traditionally good and bad are thought to just be sort of expressions of the desire of God. Something is good because that flows from God's nature. And if these concepts of desire and pleasure and pain just flow from the nature of the universe, maybe we can just say that that's what morality is. It's the good and bad that we feel. We feel it because we are expressions of the universe. And so, like, our sort of concepts of good and bad are expressions of the universe's conception of good and bad. Maybe. I get it gets a little bit murky. But if I were to say to you, for example, Philip, I'm totally convinced, fine-tuning, there's got to be an explanation, and I think that there's a God, and you said to me, but then you've got to explain suffering, and I just said to you, okay, God is amoral, would you say, well, I disagree with you, I think you're wrong? Or would you say, yeah, maybe, fair enough, but I've just got this other view? Like, how committed are you to the view that in order to solve this problem, we limit God's power instead of limiting his goodness?
Maybe you have a more hedonistic meta-ethics than me. I suppose, look, I mean, I think you could have, as a panpsychist, I think you could have pleasure and pain maybe in a universe where there's just hydrogen. Maybe there's ecstasy in, I think Galen Strawson, my PhD supervisor, I studied with him because he was basically the only
panpsychist in the world, yeah.
So when I studied with him, I talk about this bit of my book, Galileo's Error. He thinks, there's bliss before evolution. It's evolution brings in suffering because that kind of motivates you to survive. So the rest of the universe is blissful. Okay, but what you get with the right constants is complex organisms that can ultimately become rational and reflect on their own existence and make moral choices and have understanding. So I think there's a very great value in, poetry and philosophy and understanding reality, or trying to understand reality. There's a great value there that you wouldn't just get in a universe of blissful hydrogen. So I want an explanation of how come at the start of the universe you get the right numbers for those kind of great values. Then don't make them inevitable, but that are compatible with them in a small range that are compatible with them. So I don't see how your amoral God would explain that. I think you've got to say, well, in some way, the creator, which could be just the universe, aimed at something of value. Now, they might have aimed at something of value to destroy it, but then, okay, well, tell me more about the story. There's this psychology, and it gets complicated. So that's how I'm thinking of it.
Just thinking there, the way you said, like, this creator, but maybe the creator just is the universe. Our language is a bit tricky here, because when you say, well, the creator is just the universe, I'm kind of picturing the universe as this big orb that is then creating stuff like within itself, and it kind of gets a bit difficult to conceptualize. How interested are you in like non-Western philosophical traditions? The reason I ask is because, like, if you were to ask someone from the Vedic tradition, if you were to ask a Hindu, they would probably say that, the closest approximation to God is Brahman, which is sort of the unknowable knower, the unmoved mover, it always has to be described in these quite mystical terms. And they say it's not quite like this being who creates the world. It's rather kind of just everything that is Brahman. And it seems to be like, maybe because it's always a little bit vague, because it has to be, it seems a little bit easier to get across this idea that you're not talking about some creative dude who comes along and goes, zap, there's a universe. But you're also not talking about this super naturalistic view where a universe just starts going zap, zap, zap and bringing things into existence. There's just this sort of one creative force that we're all a part of. I wonder, are you like attracted to that? Because it seems to me from what you're saying, if we hadn't used the word Christianity yet or whatever, and you said, these are some of the thoughts I'm having, I would say, Philip, you're starting to sound a bit like a Hindu, sooner than I would say, heretical Christianity.
Yeah, so as I said earlier, I was an atheist for 30 years. But in that time, I was sort of spiritual but not religious kind of person. I've always been taken mystical experiences very seriously. And I think being a panpsychist, you're better able to do that. Maybe we could talk about that. And I guess I always thought, like many spiritual but not religious people, Buddhism is deep. Advaita Vedanta has spiritual depths. But, Christianity is all about, doing what the old guy in the sky wants so you get to heaven. And part of what has brought me back to Christianity, though, is discovering the mystical traditions of Christianity that have always been there since the start. And particularly the Eastern Church and how they think about the core of Christianity. So I think, when I was growing up, this is what I thought was the core of Christianity. We're all sinners. We deserve to burn in hell forever. Fortunately, Jesus is up for taking the rap for us. So we're going to, if we accept that kind gift, we'll go to heaven, right? And, this sort of makes no intellectual sense to me in sorts of ways. Like, why does it fulfill justice to punish an innocent person? And also it doesn't make sense to me on a spiritual level. My sensus divinitatis just kind of says, nah. But then, what I've discovered embarrassingly fairly recently is, that version of Christianity, which we call penal substitution, was invented basically by the Protestant reformers 500 years ago. It has not been a form of Christianity back to the start. This is one of the things I say on X that seems to most annoy people.
I've seen
because I think a lot of Americans think that is Christianity and you're a heretic if you don't. No, this was, invented by Calvin and Luther, basically.
So what's the idea before that in terms of Jesus' sacrifice, if not a
There
penal
has never
substitution?
been, so there was big decisions and councils about the Trinity and, the divinity of Christ and so on. But there was never any official decision on how to understand how Jesus brought salvation, the mechanism there. And in fact, and what I've become fascinated with is how the Eastern Church thinks about this, right? So it has absolutely nothing to do with sin and punishment. It's all to do with God and humanity and the entire universe becoming one, right? So God's not interested in finding someone to punish for our sins. God's fundamental desire is to become one with the entire universe. And so this is what they think the Jesus stuff was all about. It was all about, it was a crucial part of this ongoing process of God and the universe becoming one. God became more like us so that we can become more like God. So when I, learned about this fairly recently, it's a form of Christianity that deeply resonates me on a spiritual level. I think it fits with panpsychism. I think it makes sense of mystical experiences that I take very seriously. And while at the same time this was happening, I think, as I said, I think there's head and heart things going on here. So at the same time, I become convinced intellectually by the fine tuning that there's a purpose to the universe. And then I learn about this, how the Eastern Orthodox Church think about the core of Christianity. And then I think, this seems to me like a plausible view of what the purpose of the universe might be. Okay. And so the head and heart kind of came together at that point.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting account, and I appreciate you sort of telling me how it happened in fact. But I'm kind of interested in a few questions here. One of which is like this figure of Jesus, because the thing that really distinguishes Christianity is the Jesus character, right?
Yeah.
This particular human being who is also God, who does something through his crucifixion and resurrection that brings us into unity with God. Traditionally, in terms of forgiveness from sin, because we can't be unified to God if we're in a state of sin, and so he does that for us. But even if not, there's still a sense in which he dies for us. Like, while we're still sinners, Christ died for us. And if the job of Jesus was just to become more like us so we can become more like God, it seems like an unnecessary extravagance that he gets crucified by the Romans, right? He could have just come to earth, lived a life, ascended into heaven, Bob's your uncle, as they say. The other question that springs out to me about Christianity, on your view, is that if the universe is just God, for want of a better word, then, like, as far as we are all manifestations of consciousness that are within the universe, we're all expressions of God. We all have the divine within us. We've all sort of come from the same place. In what special sense can Jesus be God in a way that you and I are not on this view? Because for the traditional Christian, it's like, well, there's a kind of dualism. There's this world, and then there's heaven, and there's God. And Jesus is God, or Jesus is special because that external realm has sort of entered into our world. The word becomes flesh and dwells among us. Whereas on your view, everything does that. Everything springs out of this divinity of the universe. So what's so special about Jesus?
Yeah, so I think you asked me earlier, is my view a form of pantheism or panentheism? So pantheism being the view that God just is the universe, they're just one and the same thing. Whereas panentheism being the universe is within God. So God is more expansive than the universe, but the universe is sort of embedded within God.
Or like a part of God.
Yeah. And I think if I was just going off the fine-tuning and the panpsychism, I'd be a pantheist. Insofar as I've embraced Christianity, and I think that's a matter of faith rather than certainty, I suppose I'd be more inclined to a panentheist view. So there's more to God than the universe. The universe is within God, as St. Paul said, in God we live and move and have our being, but there's more to God than the universe. So I suppose the core of the Eastern view, which they call deification, right? The idea is that they say we will become gods. So the way the Eastern Church thinks about it, right? The idea is for these two things to become tightly unified. this is what they see in Jesus' beautiful metaphor about the vine and the branches. He says, "I am the vine, you are the branches." Think of that intimate, organic connection between a vine and its branches. But the thought is, there's a problem, that we're really different to God, or we're really different to that bit of God that's outside of the universe. Philosopher Robin Collins has a nice analogy, is that it would be like trying to graft a branch onto a horse, trying to bring us together with God, trying to unify God and us would be like trying to graft a branch onto a horse. They sort of just don't fit together. So to solve that problem, to close the gap, God had to share in our form of existence. In life, in suffering, in death, fully share in human existence in order to allow us to ultimately fully share in God's form of existence. And that's what the Eastern Church, they're happy to say, we will become gods.
Yeah.
We won't become identical with God, but we will fully share in God's form of existence. What it's like to be God will ultimately be what it's like to be us. It almost sounds heretical in itself, but that is just, I think to American Protestant Christians, that's heresy. But that is the standard view in the Eastern Orthodox Church.
Okay, so panentheism as opposed to pantheism means there's something outside of the universe, which is God. And so does that mean that the thing that's special about Jesus is that whilst you and I are expressions of the universe, Jesus is somehow an expression of like the whole thing? Because Jesus is also just an expression of the universe. But is it like there's something about this outside the universe God sort of thing that enters into Jesus? I'm still a little bit confused about what it is that's special about Jesus. And also, it starts to sound a bit similar to just traditional Christianity. Like, yeah, the universe is kind of, if you want to call it a part of God, fine. But the main thing is that that God is bigger than the universe. God is outside of the universe, and that the universe kind of exists through him, and Jesus enters into that. It starts to sound almost a bit orthodox.
Yeah, so the Eastern Church distinguishes between two aspects of God, the essence of God and what they call God's energies. So the essence is the fundamental identity of God, which they take to be completely unknowable, completely transcendent, completely beyond human understanding. Whereas God's energies are God's form of existence, God's manifestation, God as a living force that is immanent and that we ultimately participate in. So I suppose that the specialness of Jesus, I suppose, would be Jesus understood as part of God's essence that we will never be. So it's different to Advaita Vedanta, because on Advaita Vedanta, we are Brahman because there's nothing more than Brahman.
Yeah, tell us what that means.
Advaita Vedanta is a form of Hindu mysticism. Literally means non-dual.
Yeah.
The non-dual form of Vedanta, where all there is Brahman, ultimate reality, ultimate divine reality, if you like. And the word Atman, which is the word for the fundamental self or soul. And the core of Advaita Vedanta is that Atman is Brahman. What I refer to with the I pronoun, my deepest self is Brahman. And that there's nothing more than Brahman. So the Eastern Church doesn't go that far. In terms of God's essence, that will always be distinct from us. But in terms of God's form of existence, God's manifestation, what it's like to be God, we will fully share in that. I like to sort of speculate whether mystics in these two traditions were having the same experiences, but interpreting them in different ways, having this sense of oneness with the divine. So in the Eastern Church as well, there is a deep oneness with the divine. It's not quite as radical as Advaita Vedanta, but there's still that oneness, whether they're just interpreting the same experiences in different ways. But you said, this is sounding orthodox. In terms of my core spiritual understanding of Christianity, it is just the non-heretical view of the Eastern Orthodox Church. I call myself a heretic, I suppose, to flag up that non-standard in certain respects. I've got a non-standard view of the resurrection. For example, I don't think the resurrection experiences were a matter of seeing and touching a body. I think they were a matter of visionary experiences. I'm very influenced by Dale Allison,
which is not to say false. It's not to say that they're not like real or true.
No, I think there was a radical transformation in reality. God and the universe coming closer together, the possibility of deification. And I think what happened on Easter Sunday morning is people, starting with Mary Magdalene and then Peter, were getting thrown to the ground, experiencing deification for the first time in human history. And that was the radical experience that kicked off Christianity. So I think there was something real going on here. It wasn't just, feeling good about things. But I don't think it was seeing and touching a body.
Can I ask why you don't go that far? You said just before that the Eastern Orthodox Church, which you're not a member of, by the way, you've spoken about the Eastern tradition, which you're attracted to, but you like people might get the impression, you are an Eastern Orthodox Christian now, but that's not what you're saying.
No. So whilst I accept the core understanding of Christianity from the Eastern Church, I think there's other things I disagree with. They think God's all powerful. They believe in bodily resurrection. And also, they don't have women priests. They think gay sex is sinful. And I think these are manifestly false and harmful, right? So actually, where I found my spiritual home is in the combination of the mysticism of the Eastern Church and the liberal flexibility of the Anglican Church. So I'm a practicing if you just had the liberal flexibility of the Anglican Church, you say it's a bit wet, it's a bit empty, it's mostly based around drinking tea, as the comedian Dylan Moran said. But it's the combination of the two, sort of the spiritual depths of the Eastern Church, which is the core of my spiritual life, but also the flexibility of the Anglican Church, that you have women priests, that you have a more flexibility in how you
now a woman Archbishop of Canterbury, indeed.
Yeah.
But so you're not Eastern Orthodox, but you said a moment ago like that they don't go as far as to call everything Brahman, as to say that I, in my deepest self, am the same thing as Brahman. Why don't you go that far? I mean, it seems like quite an attractive view. I just wonder if there's something in this Vedic, Brahmanic philosophy that makes you go, I'm not so on board with that, I'm more on Team Jesus. Because, like I said earlier, without hearing much more detail than what you've said today, I would say that you sound sort of quite compatible with a Vedic view of the world, and it feels a bit trickier to explain the uniqueness of Jesus and certainly the crucifixion and resurrection stuff, like so this added material. It just seems like we are all just manifestations of Brahman, and it's all sort of one big thing called the universe, and that's what consciousness is. And consciousness, the self, is the same thing as the universe. Brahman, Atman is Brahman. It just seems to sort of go together quite well, you know what I mean? And I wonder if there's something that puts you off that.
I suppose I do struggle with where the bad stuff comes from for Advaita Vedanta, which is the problem with all the religions. If there's just Brahman, why is there suffering? Now, of course, Christianity has this problem as well.
Yeah,
I've got a slightly heretical answer to that God is limited, but God is trying to create something new and something good, which is creation, which is partly separate from God, and then ultimately a unity between God and creation.
And that's what Jesus does.
And that's that's the core movement in this. So my interpretation of Christianity, God's on the way to making a perfect universe, but unfortunately can only do that in 2 stages. God can't just create it like that. God can only do it in 2 stages. Firstly, creating a kind of okay universe with the right numbers to create life, a life to evolve. And then when it's evolved enough, starting to unify with it. So it's going to be really good in the end.
I think it doesn't quite have the same ring to it, does it? Like in Genesis, and he looked upon what he had made and he saw that it was okay. Yeah. It's all right. It'll do for now.
It's going to be really good in the end, though. But and God's like, oh, I'm sorry, it's going to be messy, evolution and cancer and all that. But is this or nothing? Whereas, I had a recent discussion with a Advaita Vedanta mystic and expert, and where does the bad stuff come from? And then they could say to me, well, it's an illusion. There isn't really bad stuff. And then I'm like, okay, this is mysticism too far. That there is bad stuff, and I want to know where it comes from. So in my slightly heretical version of Eastern Orthodox, we've got an answer.
Yeah,
that we're building something good, a unity between God and creation, and it's just messy along the way. But God's limited, and so that's the only way he can do it. So
that's not unheard of in the Christian tradition too. You know, this idea of like bad is just a privation of good. It doesn't really exist. Those ideas, and what you said earlier resonates with me, that a lot of the time I don't want to do the sort of hippy dippy, everyone saying the same thing, man. There are clearly doctrinal distinctions between religious groups. But when it comes to the mystical tradition, when it comes to the experiential stuff, there does seem to be a lot of getting at the same thing in different words.
Yes.
I mean, I could read a passage from John 17, I talk about this a lot, and it would sound like I'm reading a piece of Hindu scripture. It'd sound like I'm reading, I don't know what text I'd be reading, something from the Vedas or the Bhagavad Gita or something, where Jesus is saying like, praying for his disciples and saying, just as we are one, Father, may they be one with each other and one with me, and me and you and them and me, so that we all may be created, brought into perfect unity. We may all ultimately be one together. Now, Christians, of course, slot that into their theology, which, they can do. But on the surface, at least, it's like, that sounds a little bit weird. When Jesus has said, I and the Father are one, and in explaining what he means I'm in the Father and the Father's in me. And then goes on to say, well, I want all of the disciples and then all Christian believers to be in me just as I'm in you. You get this, again, this deification, this idea that however Jesus was one with the Father, he's kind of like the prototype for all of humankind. Now, for me, this is really interesting. I'm like, cool, so there's this guy called Jesus and he was some kind of divine figure and awesome. And I'm totally on board. I'm like, that makes perfect sense. But then he gets crucified. And then you get these sort of post-resurrection appearances and stuff. And it just seems to me that if that's all Jesus was trying to do, and there was no punishment for sin, and it was just a case of coming down to provide the way for deification, where does like the crucifixion slot into this?
Yeah, so there were two things there. Well, maybe this would be a good moment to slip in that I've just finished a new book called Heresy. It's probably been about a year before it comes out. But part of that is diving into the mystical traditions we get in all the faiths. And I'm talking more about the Abrahamic faiths, because I think people think, oh, they're not very spiritual. Is Buddhism spiritual? But you've got Kabbalah in Judaism, you've got Sufism in Islam, and you've got the mystical traditions in Christianity. I'm looking at Ibn Arabi, the Sufi mystic who thought that, God is completely beyond understanding. Even Allah is not God. That sounds heretical for a Muslim, but when you think of ultimate reality as Allah, you're qualifying it, you're relating to it, whereas ultimate reality is beyond qualification. What you were pointing to there, I think, was the Last Supper narrative in John's Gospel, where it's very, Jesus gives this kind of after-dinner speech, as it were, and the disciples are saying, oh my God, you're finally telling us how it is, you're finally giving it us straight. Now, what does he say? He doesn't say, right, you've all been bad people, someone has to pay the price, someone's going to be punished, I'm going to take the rap. No, he talks about oneness repeatedly. It's like, as you say, I'm the Father and one, and you are in me and I am in you. It's like this intimate connection where both things are inside each other, paradoxically. And it's like this deep unity between Jesus and the being he called Father being taken out to the rest of humanity and creation. So I see deification. I think that's what he's talking about. I think he's saying this is what it's all about. Okay, but you're pushing me. I'm being a politician, dodging the question here on the crucifixion. So why was this horrific, painful death? I would say it's partly about deification, sharing fully in our miserable existence, the more gruesome aspects. I like to think also it's partly cosmic solidarity or part of the revelation of God that we're supposed to get through Jesus. St. Paul says Jesus is the image of the invisible God. Why is Jesus in Luke's gospel born in poverty, put where the animals eat, greeted by shepherds rather than kings? I think this is expressing that God identifies with the poor, the weak, the excluded. So what a wonderful sign of that than seeing God as this naked, executed, humiliated peasant suffering the cruelest form of punishment that was reserved for the lowest of the low. I think it's a sign that God is on the side of immigrants in cages, is on the side of the weak and the powerless, and something which some Christians have forgotten. But yeah, so that's how I think of it anyway.
So it's kind of like a display of
this is what
solidarity.
I'm all about.
This is who I am, and this is what I'm for. I mean, I guess that is probably the ultimate way of doing that. And Christians speak in those terms, even if you took away their reflections on the nature of Jesus' sacrifice, they still say, but the reason why it was crucifixion. Because if Jesus just has to die for your sins, he could have just sort of been euthanized in his sleep. They say, no, the reason that he did it with crucifixion is to demonstrate that this sort of this concern with the poor and the downtrodden, identification with the weakest of society. And in the same way that you can separate out those questions, you can probably also then separate out those concepts. And you can say, even if you don't need the punishment for sin stuff for Jesus to be special, you still have this very good reason for him to ultimately demonstrate his identification. He's already shown us that he's identified with the highest of the high, because he's got God inside of him. So if he can show us that he's also identified with the lowest of the low, but that sort of raised a question for a lot of people as to, for example, why wasn't Jesus a woman? Women are more downtrodden in society than men are. So if Jesus had been a woman and crucified as a woman,
that's a good point.
But then I've heard people respond to that by saying that the humiliation of women is so kind of normalized in various contexts that there's almost something more humiliating about being up on the cross as a man. And depending on who says that, that's either a very feminist or a very anti-feminist perspective. Because you've got the anti-feminist who says, well, it's more humiliating for a man because it's just worse for a man to do. And then you've got the feminist saying, because we're so used to seeing women humiliated.
Yeah. And Tom Holland in his book Dominion has expressed how powerful that idea was. That God is not the king in the castle, but is this executed. But it was weird, and as we sort of gets normalized.
But I also kind of want to then ask, it gets to the point of parody, but if we think the universe is consciousness and, there's nothing necessarily that's super special about human beings exactly, why isn't Jesus a rodent or something? Surely the way to really demonstrate his sort of identification with the lowest of the lowest to be an animal who's sort of, literally fit for slaughter. Maybe there's just a communication issue there, but
it has to be.
You sort of got to draw a line somewhere, I suppose.
Look. I mean, what I'm very happy to embrace is there's a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, sure.
So, and I can go further than that. I'm very uncertain as to whether any of this is true. I don't think faith is about certainty. I think it's about hope and trust and commitment. It's about living something out. I think often people think about, am I going to join a religion? They have to think, is it definitely true? Oh no, there's some objection. But these things are always going to be incredibly uncertain. I think what you should think, if you're thinking of joining a religion, I think you should think, am I going to get something out of it? And is it a credible possibility? So I think evidence and arguments are, is it a credible possibility? It's always going to be very uncertain. So I suppose I've got to the point where I think this slightly heretical, Eastern Orthodox inspired Anglican version of Christianity is a credible possibility. But that leaves open that other religions, like maybe Advaita Vedanta, are also credible possibilities, leaves open a kind of pluralism that doesn't just say, oh, they're all saying the same thing, but says, if it's all about certainty, then only one can be the one where we can be certain it's true. But if we're open to like 30%, then there can be multiple religions where it's credible enough to be possible. So I feel confident enough to commit, and that's brought me great joy. It's brought me community. It's brought me structure. It's brought me spiritual practice. That's brought many life benefits. So that's what I'm trying to do in this new book, Heresy, actually, is just aiming kind of at the spiritual but not religious. This huge, ever-growing group. I'm not saying, look, here's the one true faith, you've got to believe it or you're going to hell. Just saying, look, there's things you can get out of religion, tradition, structure, community, and there's ways of engaging it that might avoid some of the worries you have. You can be very uncertain, you can be a bit heretical, you can take it all as a big metaphor if you want. There's a physics professor in my church who is a very spiritual person there every week. He says to me, what's all this mumbo jumbo you believe? I'm too orthodox. He doesn't believe any of the specifics of Christianity. Now, of course, some churches will kick you out, but I don't know, a lot of Anglican churches or Quakers, no one's going to interrogate you. And so, yeah, that's my message, really.
Yeah. And you land on saying you are a Christian? Like, would you describe that? I mean, I understand you qualify it because we're having a conversation about your beliefs, but in your day-to-day, would you just say to people sort of who ask you on the street, like, I'm a Christian? Is that like your view now?
Yeah, I suppose the only reason I qualify it is because so many identify Christianity with a very particular form, maybe sort of US evangelical Christianity. And I'm not saying evangelical Christians are horrible people. A lot of them are my very good friends. But that's not the kind of Christianity I find plausible, spiritually resonates with me. So I suppose I might qualify it just because people may get an idea that's different from the truth. But yeah, I'm a Christian, sure. It's an important part of my life, and it's made me quite happy. I don't know if it's true, but made me quite happy. So,
well, maybe that's all that matters. I mean, at least it does for the individual. Like, who cares doctrinally when it comes to experience of the divine? I mean, I talk all the time about how people who report having intense religious experiences, they just sort of give up on the intellectualizing and realize that that's kind of not what it's about. And so, it's interesting to talk about, but I would be interested in seeing this fleshed out in an intellectual fashion, which it sounds like you've kind of done in this book, which I'm excited to read. You should send me a proof copy. I'd love to have a flip through.
I'd love to.
That would be really, really cool to see. And I think people are interested in, I don't want to say your journey, because we were talking before we started recording about how people often do that. They do that to you and they do it to me as well. Like, as soon as you say anything friendly to Christianity, it's like, awesome, look, this person's on board. And then when you say, yeah, but I'm not sure God is all powerful, or yeah, but I'm not sure Jesus claimed to be God, then it's like, he's on a journey, he'll get there eventually. He'll get there eventually. And like you said before we started recording, like, maybe you're already there. Maybe this is just the place to end up,
Yeah, next time I talk to an evangelical Christian, I'm going to say, oh, you're on a
journey towards limited power God. You'll get there eventually.
I mean, insofar as I'm embracing the core of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, that's much older than the Protestant idea of penal substitution that was like 500 years ago. You often get the sense that there can't be innovation.
Yeah.
Right? But religions have always reimagined themselves. Aquinas was radically new philosophy at the time. The Protestant reformers had a radically new understanding of what it meant to be a Christian. So what's wrong with this? Maybe thinking maybe God's not all powerful in the way we previously thought, and maybe this is just part of our moral understanding. I find like the problem of evil, I think you might agree with this, Alex, becomes more pressing as we've advanced morally and understood the importance of animal suffering, for example. So maybe this is part of progress and progressing in our understanding of God. That no, God's not going to be cruel enough to create a world like this if she could help it. There's another thing that winds up. Conservative Christians too.
You're doing that on purpose.
Yeah, with Craig, he said, when he was talking about my book, and he said, and he uses the word she. I don't know. I mean,
I remember that.
But these snowflakes, these traditionalists, they can't just, stop being so triggered, man.
Yeah.
I think, God's obviously non-binary, so they is a good pronoun, the Trinity as well.
Yeah, I think it sounds controversial to say, but it's because God is like not any of these things. It's like, God is not conceptualizable into like, categories, and our categories of spatial extension and thought, and you're like, oh, so God's non-binary. Then it's like, no, you liberal. But yeah, I know what you mean.
But look, I don't hate conservatives, but I think actually in most of society there can be a natural balance between progressives and conservatives. Progressives who are saying, look, we need to update in certain ways, and conservatives saying, hold on, let's be careful, let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. And there can be a nice balance. I think recently with religion, it's more dominated by conservatives, especially in the US. So I guess part of what I'm trying to do with this book is to try and help liberals make intellectual sense of religion, not so we can kick out the conservatives, but so we can maybe get back to that natural balance that exists in a lot of society.
Well, we will wait in anticipation until it arrives. The books that are already out are in the description if people want to buy them and read them. And whenever this new one's out, we'll try to remember to put a link there too. So if you're watching a few years in the future, it should be down there too. And if it's not, leave us a comment, send us an email, and we'll get that fixed immediately. Philip Goff, thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Alex. A pleasure as always.